I'm Phil Hellmuth. In this lesson, I'm going to talk to you about some of the most overvalued hands in poker, suited connectors. A suited connector is exactly what it sounds like. Two cards of the same suit whose numerical values are an integer apart. So, a hand like 6-7 of hearts, for example. A few years ago, most amateurs would almost never consider playing these kind of hands before the flop, and certainly never for a raise. But then televised poker took off, and the same players who wouldn't consider playing these hands in their $1 and $2 pot limit and no limit home games started watching their favorite pros take down big pots with them in $10,000 buy-in tournaments. Do you hear me, Daniel Negreanu? 7-8 of clubs. Nice flop, 5-6-9. Suddenly, suited connectors became the hottest hands in poker. The thing is, though, suited connectors aren't all they're cracked up to be. I'm not saying they're bad hands. In fact, they can be very profitable under the right circumstances. The problem is those circumstances are nowhere near as common as most players think. For example, let's say you're holding the 8-9 offsuit, 8 of clubs, 9 of spades, in middle position at a fairly loose and aggressive table. Is this a hand you want to play in this spot? Of course not. So why does the hand suddenly become so much more attractive if it's 9-8 of hearts? You're still only holding 9 high. And the fact that it's suited? Yeah, great. That's going to help you maybe 2%, maybe 3%. The reason players love suited connectors is because they think they'll get paid off for a big pot if and when they hit their hand. And it will happen occasionally. But let's say you flop your flush while you're holding a hand like the 5-6 of clubs. Are you still going to like your chances of winning the pot if another club falls on the turn? Of course not. So when should you play suited connectors? If you're the first player into the pot in late position, you can certainly play suited connectors for a raise against your opponents in the blinds. Otherwise, remember that these are very speculative hands, which means that you should be looking to see cheap flops with them from other spots at the table. Suited connectors can also be profitable in multi-way pots, especially if you can see the flop for a cheap price. In these cases, you stand a greater chance of getting paid off if you hit your straight or flush, because it's likely that at least one opponent will be willing to call you down with a hand like top pair or two pair. Conversely, be prepared to throw that hand away if there's action in front of you and you didn't hit the flop, or you didn't pick up any kind of draw, or you flop bottom pair, because chances are you're drawing thin and you can't win the pot. So with suited connectors, the lesson is this. Just be very careful with them. I mean, I know personally that they just don't win that often. And you know what really pisses me off? Is when I have the 9-10 of spades, and it comes 6-7-8, and I've called a raise, and I'm like, yeah, baby, I'm starting to count up the chips already. You know what I'm saying? Everybody checks, and I make a little bet, and they all fold. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. I hit my suited connector perfectly, and I got zero action. So, suited connectors just are not what they're cracked up to be. I'm Phil Hellmuth Jr. We've all heard someone say how their fate changed on the turn of a card. Let me tell you something. That's happened to me lots of times. One card here, one card there. Maybe I don't have as many championships. Maybe I have more. Well, in poker, the fate of your hand often changes with the turn card. In this lesson, we'll look at some strategies that will help you survive or thrive when you're facing the turn. Now, the key to playing the turn is to understand when you want to shut down any further betting and when you're okay with leaving the betting open. Closing the action simply means that your opponent can't bet again on that round. For example, if your opponent checks to you and you check behind, you've closed the action on the turn and you're going to see the river card. If, on the other hand, your opponent checks to you and you bet out, you're leaving the action open and giving your opponent a chance to call or raise you. Likewise, if your opponent bets the turn and you call, you're closing the action. But if your opponent bets and you raise, you're leaving the action open and giving your opponent an opportunity to 3-bet against you or maybe move all in. He might put some heat on you, baby. The reason this is important is because there are many times you may have the best hand on the turn, but it's not strong enough to withstand a raise or a re-raise from your opponent. This is often true when you're holding something like top pair, which can be especially vulnerable. If you only have one pair on the turn, opening up the action to your opponent is dangerous because if you get check raised, you're most likely going to have to fold, and you may well be folding the best hand. Well, let's look at an example. Let's say you have King Jack on a board of King 9 4 7. If your opponent checks to you, checking back isn't bad because the board isn't dangerous, and giving your opponent a free card isn't likely to hurt your hand. In other words, it's unlikely as a straight draw, there's no flush draws out there. Betting here, however, can cause you trouble. If you have your opponent beat, they are probably intending to do one of two things after you bet: fold or check raise. If your opponent folds and your bet earns you nothing, of course you do win the pot, but you don't make any more money from the hand. And if they check raise, then your bet lost you the entire pot because you're probably going to have to fold King Jack, which is an even worse outcome. If you're up against a better hand than yours, betting isn't good either. If you check, you lose absolutely no money on the turn, but if you bet, you lose the amount that you bet in addition to whatever money was already in the pot. While betting marginal hands can be costly on the turn, raising with them can be profitable because when you raise in the turn, you put a lot of pressure on your opponent. You might raise, for example, with the King 9 7 4 board with nines with the 10 and force your opponent to throw away the King Jack. Take that! Yeah, you're going to make me fold King Jack. I'm going to make you fold King Jack. You can raise by either check raising when you're out of position or by just raising when you're in position. Either way, it's a very strong play because it makes it very hard for your opponent to call, even if he's holding a hand like King Queen. So remember, while raising on the flop often signals weakness, raising on the turn often signals real strength, which is why it's a more effective play. So basically, when it comes to leaving the action open or closed on the turn, you really have to kind of pay attention to what your opponent's been doing all day, his tendencies. Is it the kind of player, do you know he's weak? Do you actually want him to check raise when you have King Jack on the King 9 7 4 board? More often than not, you probably don't because, so closing the action is a very smart move when you have a marginal hand on the turn. I'm Phil Hellmuth. Because the turn card is often the most critical card in the hand, playing the river is often fairly straightforward. In this lesson, I'm going to give you 3 basic questions to consider before you bet your hand on the river. The key to playing the river is to understand exactly what your hand is worth. And to do this, there are 3 questions you should ask yourself before you decide to make a bet on the river. Question number 1, am I bluffing? Question number 2, if I'm not bluffing, is there a logical hand that my opponent has that's worse than mine and that will pay me off? In other words, is there a hand worse than mine that my opponent has that he will also call with? Question number 3, how vulnerable is my hand to getting bluffed? Now let's answer question number 1. If you know you're bluffing, you can always bet on the river because that's going to be the only way you can win the pot. And if you know you're holding the worst hand, your decision to bet comes down to whether or not you think your bluff will work. If you think you can take the pot, then bet it. Go get it, kid. Make that bluff. River bluff. Be a man. If you can't, then check and concede the hand. If you're not bluffing, question number 2, then you have to decide if your opponent has a worse hand than yours that he's willing to pay you off with. Let's say you're holding Queen 10 of hearts and you're looking at a board of King of hearts, 8 of hearts, Queen of diamonds. So basically, you flopped second pair in a flush draw. Now say a 3 and a 9 come off. So basically, you didn't make 2 pair, you didn't make a flush, which means now you're holding second pair with a 10 kicker. It's not great, but your opponent has checked you, and now you have to decide whether to value bet. With second pair, you're certainly not bluffing, and you may actually have the best hand. In fact, I think it's like 50-50 here. But the question is there a hand that's worse than yours that can actually call your bet? Since there is very little that your opponent can be holding that he'd be willing to call you with, betting here doesn't really earn you anything. And if for some reason your opponent actually has you beat, betting here will cost you money. In this spot, since betting basically adds zero value, your best play is to check your hand on the river and hope your pair holds up. In fact, what if your opponent is holding Jack 10 and the 9 made him a straight? He's going to check raise you. The last question is really about whether you should check down on the river. This is something you'll usually want to consider when you have a marginal hand like top pair, since you would likely have to fold to a raise from your opponent. All right, let's take a look at an example. Say you have the ace 9 and the board is ace, 10, 8, 7, deuce. If you bet, there's no logical hand that will just call, since even ace jack has you beat. That means either your opponent will fold or you'll get raised and have to fold your hand. Now, of course, maybe a value bet here isn't so bad. You can beat ace 6 and ace 5 and ace 4 and ace 3, and you can beat a lot of tens. But basically, it's a no-win situation. There's just not much you can beat. You're not going to win any more money than what's already in the pot, and you might get raised off of your hand by a bluff or a hand that really has you beat. So checking your hand down is the smartest play you can make in this spot. Also, notice this is the same problem you face when you open the action on the turn. You don't win any more money by betting, and you lose the whole pot when you're check raised or bluffed. And when you're facing a better hand, you lose money that you could have saved by just checking your hand down. I'm Phil Hellmuth Jr. In our last lesson, we looked at 3 questions you should ask yourself about your hand before you decide to bet on the river. Now, we're going to look at how you can extract the most value from your hand when you do decide to bet the river. Talking value betting here, ladies and gentlemen. Once you decide that betting on the river makes sense and that you're not likely to get raised by an opponent who's bluffing or holding a better hand, the question becomes, how much more money is your opponent willing to pay you? The only real way to answer that question is to understand your opponent. Since anyone holding a hand worse than yours is likely to be worried about whether they're really ahead or not, the fact is they're not likely to call a very big bet on the river. This means that even a bet of half the pot can sometimes be too much. And if you do bet big on the river, the only hands that are likely to call are ones that actually have you beat, which is a whole different kind of disaster. That doesn't always mean that you have to make a small bet on the river, though, because against the right opponent, you can sometimes bet your hand very big and still get paid off. Let's say you're holding a big hand like a set or a flush on the river and are facing an aggressive opponent. If you bet big on the river, he may call with a worse hand because he reads you as being weak and thinks you're trying to chase him out of the pot. In this case, you're making a very strong hand look like a bluff in order to get your opponent to try to pick you off, in order to try to make the huge hero call with the worse hand. In short, knowing who you're up against is the key to knowing how much money your hand is worth on the river. Against timid opponents, you're going to bet less, because they're not going to want to put a lot of money into the pot if they think they're behind. But against aggressive opponents, you can sometimes bet much bigger than they'd expect, because your hand will look weak when it actually has them crushed. Sometimes make a huge bet against these aggressive guys. They think you're bluffing, and you're stacking all their chips, baby. I'm Phil Hellmuth Jr. In our last session, we talked about how you should play your hand if you flop top pair in position. Now, we're going to look at some techniques for playing top pair when you're out of position. Well, flopping top pair out of position isn't as bad as flopping air out of position. Yeah, obviously. It can be a lot more expensive if you're not careful. Why? Remember, being out of position puts you at a huge disadvantage to your opponent by forcing you to act first throughout the hand. If you have nothing but air on the spot, it's often easier to slow down your play and get away from your hand when your opponent plays back at you than it is to give up on something as strong as top pair in the same situation. For this reason, it's even more important to keep the pot small when you're playing top pair out of position than it is to play the same hand in position. Let's look at the same hand we used in our last lesson, our same example. You have ace queen. The flop is ace 9-3, all offsuit, rainbow. If we happen to raise our hand pre-flop, we should just go ahead and make our standard continuation bet of 50 to 60% of the pot on the flop. Since we know our opponent is unlikely to raise us with a monster hand like trips, we can assume his hand is fairly weak if he does indeed raise. In this case, our best play is to call and bet again on the turn. However, let your instincts occasionally, if you really, it's come ace-9 through, you bet out on the flop, now the guy raises you. If something in your mind just tells you he has to be crushed, you occasionally can just fold your hand. In any case, if your opponent just calls your continuation bet on the flop, then checking the turn is a smart play, unless your hand improves. Now, if he bets behind you, you can reevaluate the strength of your hand and determine what you want to do. If he checks behind, chances are you have the best hand and you can comfortably bet the river. But if he bets behind, most likely you're going to have to call him, at least on 4th Street. Remember, while top pair may be the best, your top pair, your hand, there's also a decent chance that it's not. Keep the pot small to minimize your risk and to prevent your opponents from putting you in a spot where you're making a tough decision for a ton of chips out of position. I'm Phil Hellmuth Jr., and in this lesson we're going to talk about the goals of betting. As we've already mentioned, you want your bets to have a purpose, and you want your bets to tell a story that gets your opponents to act the way you want them to act. The question is, how do we accomplish this? Before we can reach our goal, we have to identify what it is. When it comes to betting, there are only a few specific outcomes that we're trying to achieve. We want our opponents to either fold, call, or raise. Let's say everyone has $1,500 in chips and the blinds are 15 and 30. We made a late position raise with the queen of spades, jack of clubs, queen jack offsuit, and got called by the big blind, bringing a flop of queen of hearts, jack of hearts, 4 of clubs. Top 2, baby! Even though we hit top 2 pair here, this is still kind of a scary board, as our opponent could easily have a straight draw or a flush draw, and we'd like to end the hand right now. Yeah, by them moving all in. Which means we want them to fold, or do we? The first thing to determine is what kind of player we're facing. Is he loose or is he tight? Since a loose opponent is more likely to chase his draw than a tight opponent, we're going to have to bet more in order to give him the wrong odds to call. Because our opponent is only likely to hit his draw about 1/3 of the time, this means that betting about 1/2 of the pot should be enough to get a tight opponent to fold in this spot. Think about it. There's $200 in the pot. You bet half the pot. That's $100. Now for him to call, he's getting laid 3-1. You might be able to get rid of him because he's getting the exact perfect odds to call. A tight player might fold. A loose player might call. Against a loose opponent, though, this bet is probably too small, which means we may have to make a full pot bet or even overbet the pot in order to provoke a fold. In some cases where our stack is relatively short compared to the pot, overbetting may mean moving all in here. While this can be effective, be sure the reward of winning the hand is worth the risk of losing your stack before you make this play. Now, let's look at something a little bit trickier, which is enticing your opponent to call or raise your bet. Again, let's start the hand with 1,500 in chips and the blinds at 1,530. This time we've raised it from middle position with pocket eights and got called by the big blind who has ace-9. What a flop. Ace-8-3. How can we bet to get the most out of our opponent? We don't want to give away the strength of our hand here, which means we want to make our bet look weaker, our hand look weaker. There are a few ways we can do this. If we're acting first and our opponent isn't overly aggressive, we can make a relatively small bet, say half the pot, and hope that he calls. Assuming he doesn't raise, we can either bet again on the turn or check and hope he takes the bait, hope he takes the lead, thinking his ace is good. If he does raise on the flop, we should just call and reevaluate our action on the turn. Lord forbid that we re-raise him and make him fold his ace when he's drawing dead. Conversely, if our opponent is likely to lead out on his own, we can check our hand in the hopes that he bets for us. Depending on how strong we think his hand is, we can either just call his bet and see the turn, or put in a raise of our own in order to build the pot even more. If our opponent is first to act and checks to us, we can bet our hand and hope for a call. But maybe a smarter play is to not bet here and check behind him so that our opponent will feel more confident about betting his ace on the turn. I would probably bet, though. Finally, let's talk about defensive betting, where our goal is to entice either a call or a fold from our opponent while preventing them from leading out or raising our hand. Why bet defensively? Usually, we're making these kind of bets when we have a draw, but haven't yet made our hand. For example, let's say that we've loosened up and we've played 7-8 of spades in middle position. We get called by the button, and now we're looking at the king of spades, 10 of spades, 5 of clubs. We have nothing here but a flush draw. While checking here is okay, to me it's not the best way to play because we're giving up some potential value if we hit, while at the same time giving our opponent a chance to make a bet that would force us to fold our hand. Also, I would like to bet here because I feel like 60-70% of the time I'm just going to win the pot. The trick to betting defensively is to find a number big enough to provoke either a call or a fold from our opponent while keeping the bet cheap enough that it's not costing us too much to hit our draw. Oftentimes, a bet of around 1/3 the size of the pot is the right size to accomplish this goal. I'm Phil Hellmuth Jr. As a poker player, there's often no better feeling than peeking at your hole cards to find you're holding a big pair, like 2 aces or 2 kings. Of course, there's also nothing worse than watching your big pair go down in flames to a hand like the Jack-9 of spades. Ouch! That's why this lesson is devoted to teaching you about how to get the most value out of your big pairs when they come your way. Well, we can't guarantee you're going to win the pot every time you're holding pocket aces, kings, or queens. Yeah, no kidding. We can give you some guidelines that will improve the odds that your big pairs will stand up more often than not. First, and most importantly, don't be afraid to raise or re-raise your big hands before the flop. Aces, kings, and queens are the strongest starting hands you can have in poker, and there's no reason you should be scared of playing a big pot when you're holding these hands, especially when you can narrow down the field to just 1 or 2 opponents. Remember, the value of big pairs goes down as the number of players in the pot goes up, which means limping in from early position with a hand like aces can be very, very dangerous. By limping into the pot, you're giving everyone acting behind you better odds to see the flop with a wide variety of hands that can beat you on later streets. If no one raises behind you, you're going to have to be very careful about playing your hand unless you flop a set or better. Also, don't be afraid to raise with a hand like kings or queens because you're scared of running into aces. If that happens, it happens, and that's just part of the game. The fact is, big hands don't come around very often. You should be looking to play them aggressively by raising and re-raising before the flop. Once the flop is dealt and you feel like you are facing a better hand, then don't be afraid to fold your big pair and look for a better spot later in the tournament. For example, if you're holding queens and the flop comes down ace, king, 4, with your opponents betting into you, I think you have a pretty good fold there. Chances are your hand is no good. I would also say that, if you have 2 black aces and the flop comes down 8, 9, 10 of diamonds, I'd be looking maybe to minimize the amount that I lost or even fold if the action becomes too intense. There just are horrible flops that come up sometimes when you have pocket aces or pocket kings, and you just have to be smart and take the exit with a small loss.
I'm Annie Duke. As we mentioned earlier, the relative rank of your starting cards is an important factor in determining which hands you're going to play. But it's not the only one. Your position at the table is also critical because it directly impacts how easy your decisions are going to be throughout the hand. In short, being in late position is more advantageous than being in early position. Now, before we explain why position is so important, let's begin by defining what position is. In the simplest terms, your position in the hand is always defined as your relationship to the button. Now let's break the table down into 4 quadrants: early position, middle position, late position, and then of course the blinds. At a 10-handed table, the 3 seats just to the left of the big blind would comprise early positions at the table. So if the player on the button is seat 10, the player who is first to act pre-flop is the player in seat 3, followed by seat 4 and seat 5. Now middle position would consist really of just players seated in, say, 6 and 7. And the players in the 8, 9, and 10 seats are said to be in late position. Now at this particular table, the player in the 8 seat is sitting in the hijack, while the player in the 9 seat is sitting in cutoff, and the player in the 10 seat is on the button, which is obviously the best position at the table. Now the 2 positions to the immediate left of the button are the small blind and the big blind respectively. Pre-flop, the players in the blinds have the luxury of acting last in the hand. However, after the flop, if they're still in the hand, the players in the blind are now going to have to act first, and they really need to take that into account. So now that we understand what position is, let's look at why it's so important. In this example, the player in the seat that's the 3 seat, in other words, under the gun, is technically in the worst position because he has to be the first person to decide if he's going to voluntarily put his chips into the pot. With 7 players, not including the players in the blinds, left to act behind him, this means there's a lot of potential for someone else to have a strong hand that they may want to raise or call with. Since the player in the 3 seat has no information about the strength of anyone else's hands, generally, he should only consider coming into the pot with, a premium to very solid hand, such as the bigger pocket pairs, ace, king, ace, queen. As action moves around the table, the remaining players will get to see the action that has taken place in front of them, making it easier for them to judge the relative strengths of their hole cards. Plus, they're going to have fewer people left back behind them. Now, a player in the 7 seat may decide to open the pot for a raise with a very weak hand, something like even as low as 4s or king jack. If everyone in front of him folds, because there are only a few players left to act behind him and there are fewer chances of someone having a stronger hand, he can then open up his range. Now, on the other hand, if a player in the 5 seat raises, the player in the 7 seat may just decide to call with his smaller pocket pairs in hopes of, hitting a set on the flop, or maybe bluffing if he doesn't hit since he has position on the other player. Now, with this in mind, here are some general guidelines to help you determine which hands you should play in which position. Now, in early position, you're going to want to play mostly, premium to very solid hands that either, could stand being re-raised or that you're willing to play big pots with out of position. You should be very wary of hands like ace jack or king queen because they're very easily dominated by the kinds of hands that are willing to call your raise. And when you're dominated, it can cost you a lot of chips if, in this sense, you're unlucky enough to hit something like top pair. Now, in middle position, you can begin opening up your range a little bit. Since there are fewer players to left act behind you, you can really raise with, hands like, king queen suited, king jack suited. You can start to get into like 6s, 7s, 5s, 4s. And those hands may be more troublesome in early position, but in middle position, they're playable. Now, in late position, here's the good news. You can really play almost any 2 cards, but this is important. If the action has folded around to you, in other words, if you're the first person in, you can really open up that range to most of the deck, at least the top, 70 or 80% of the deck, because you really don't have very many players to act behind you. And certainly on the button, you've only got the blinds to act, and they're always going to have to go before you on the later rounds, which is going to give you a huge advantage. Now, be careful if the blinds call or re-raise your hand, though, because the chances are they may be holding a pretty good hand of their own. Remember, though, that you will have position on them, so that should be taken into consideration about how you play out the rest of the hand. I'm Annie Duke, and in this lesson, we're going to answer one of the burning questions in poker: to limp or not to limp. Limping can be a very touchy subject for poker players. Some players like to limp so they can see cheap flops, especially when they're holding speculative hands, like suited connectors or small pairs. Other players believe you should never limp because by limping, you're inviting players into multi-way pots and limiting your chances to win the hand. While we tend to side with the more aggressive players, we certainly can't tell you that limping is never the right play. What we can tell you, though, is that it's not usually the best play. Let's start by looking at why players limp in the first place. As we've mentioned already, many players like to limp with speculative hands that they don't feel comfortable raising with pre-flop. In these cases, they're hoping to basically get lucky by hitting the flop hard and winning a big pot, or being able to let the hand go without costing themselves too much money. The problem is that players who like to limp with speculative hands are limping with a very specific set of hands, and essentially whenever they limp, they're letting the other players in the pot know something really significant about their hand, that they have something like suited connectors or small pairs. In other words, the limp is basically turning their cards face up to their opponents, which we really try not to do in poker. Another reason players will limp is to trap. The difference here is that instead of limping with a speculative hand, sort of trying to get lucky on the flop, players here are limping with a big hand like aces or kings and are hoping to win a big pot when they either flop a set or their overpair holds up and their opponents don't really put them on that. While there can be benefits to this play, certainly the downside often outweighs the reward. I mean, let's say you find aces in early position and decide to trap opponents by limping into the pot. Ideally, you're hoping for someone to raise behind you so that you can then re-raise and isolate them in a heads-up pot where you're likely to be a big favorite. This is problem number one with the limp. Because when you do re-raise your opponent, now it's really easy for them to fold a hand like, say, 2 nines or ace-jack. Whereas if you had just opened the pot for a raise with your aces, those hands like ace-jack or 2 nines would probably re-raise you, and then they could really go broke to you. Now, there's a second problem with this limp. What if nobody raises behind you? By limping with your aces, you're giving players behind you better odds to limp along with a wide variety of hands that have a potential to beat you after the flop. I mean, let's say 5 players see the flop, and the flop say 7 of spades, 9 of spades, 10 of clubs, after you've limped with your lovely 2 red aces. How likely do you think it is that your trap has now backfired when you're facing 4 opponents on a very draw-heavy board? How much more comfortable would you have been if you had just raised your hand pre-flop and were only facing 1 opponent in this situation? Not only can limping put you into uncomfortable post-flop situations, but it also takes away a potential for you to just go ahead and win the pot pre-flop. Remember, one of the goals of raising pre-flop is to thin the field of players with marginal hands who are looking to see cheap flops. If you don't raise, either with your premium hands or your speculative hands, you're removing a very important weapon from your poker arsenal. So is limping always wrong? No. There are times when it may pay to try to limp into the pot, but only under very specific circumstances. The first circumstance is, let's say that you're in a game where when you raise, you always get like 5 callers. Well, in that game, raising isn't doing too much for you, is it? If you raise, you're still getting 5 callers. So that's the kind of game where limping might make sense. Another place where limping might make sense is when you're playing at a table of very aggressive players, and you notice that every time you open for a pot, players are re-raising you, and they're re-raising you with pretty weak hands, or there's one player who's consistently punishing limpers by raising every hand, and it's making it very difficult for you to be able to play in this game. In this type of situation, you may want to limp in with a really big hand, like aces or kings, so that you can exploit and punish your opponent's over-aggressiveness by re-raising them when the action gets back to you after they've come after your limp. To make this play work, though, you have to be very confident that at least one player behind you will be willing to put in a pre-flop raise. If your table is too timid, you're only going to get yourself into trouble where you're going to find yourself playing like a 5-way pot with 2 aces, just as we discussed earlier in this lesson. I'm Annie Duke. When you make a pre-flop raise, you're telling your opponents that you have a strong hand. So what are they telling you when one of them decides to make a re-raise before the flop? That's the question we're going to try to help you answer in this lesson on facing a pre-flop re-raise. Why is facing a pre-flop re-raise any different than facing a pre-flop raise? Well, because your opponent is sending you a very clear message that they have a very strong hand. The question then becomes, should you believe them? Before we get to the answer, let's remember why we raised in the first place. We did it to accomplish a few objectives, including establishing that we have a strong, playable hand, getting opponents to fold their marginal hands, getting other opponents to define the range of the kind of hands that they are playing. When we get re-raised by a player behind us, we have clearly accomplished at least part of our goal, because if our raise says we like our hand, our opponent's re-raise says that they really like their hand. The biggest difference between getting raised and getting re-raised is that in one case we've committed to the pot, and in the other case we haven't put any chips in the pot yet. Where we have nothing invested, we don't lose anything if we fold. Where we have put chips into the pot, however, folding can become expensive. Of course, that doesn't mean that folding can't be the right play. In fact, it very often is. So let's look at what we need to consider when we get re-raised. Let's say we're in the early stages of a tournament. The blinds are 25-50 and we have 2,000 in chips. We raise to 150 from middle position with 2 8s and get re-raised to 600 by the button. What do? First, let's look at our position and that of our opponent. Since he's on the button, he'll get to act after us throughout the hand, which is a clear advantage for him. However, on the flip side, since he's on the button, we also know that he can be raising us with a wide variety of hands here. Anything from a bigger pocket pair to something like ace-king, ace-queen, or even smaller suited connectors like 9-10, or a complete bluff. How strong do we think our hand is against his probable range? Is it strong enough to call with? Or do we think we're actually ahead of our opponent? If we're ahead, is our hand strong enough to re-raise with all in? Next, let's look at what we know of our opponent's style. Is he loose and playing a lot of hands? Is he tight and only playing premium cards? Has he been bullying the table, or has he been passive? Is it too early to have any solid read on his style at all? Finally, let's look at our stack sizes in this spot. With just 2,000 in chips at the start of the hand, calling our opponent's re-raise would leave us both with only 1,400 in our stack, and looking at a pot that has 1,275 in it if we were to see the flop. That constitutes our opponent's bet of 600, plus our bet of 600, plus 25 from the small blind and 50 from the big blind. 1,400 is not a big enough return to call the extra 450 on top of the 150 that we initially raised if we don't think that we have the best hand and we have to hit a set in order to win, which is a long shot. It's also not enough to call if we don't think that we can bluff and win after the flop, which is hard to do from out of position when our stack is only about as big as what's already in the pot. Can we really afford to make a bet of 1/2 or 2/3 of the pot after the flop, or will we just have to move all in because we're already pot committed? Can we give this pot up even if we miss the flop? Considering our position and the fact that our hand is good but not great, it seems obvious that folding is the best play here. Sure, we're giving up 150 chips, but that's a small price to pay compared to the problem of putting ourselves in a situation where we could lose our entire stack and be out of the tournament. Remember, one of the reasons we raised in the first place was to gain information. We got it when our opponent re-raised, and without any clear indication that we're actually ahead in the hand at this point, we have to believe that our hand isn't strong enough to gamble with at this point in the tournament. I'm Annie Duke, and in this lesson, we're going to discuss what is sometimes known as the nuclear bomb of No Limit Hold'em, moving all in before the flop. Look, no matter how much we try to avoid it, there just comes a time in almost every tournament where we find ourselves sitting on a short or a shortish stack. While this is not a desirable spot to be in some ways it does simplify our decision-making process, because we're down to kind of an all or nothing situation. Either we're going to fold our hand pre-flop, or we're going to push all in the hopes of doubling up. There's just really no in between. Why would we ever consider moving all in pre-flop and risking all of our chips? Well, there are really two good reasons for this. First, by moving all in, we place all of the pressure in the hand onto our opponents, who must decide if they are willing to risk a significant portion of their stacks to call our bet. Because it's such a significant portion of their stacks, we're putting so much pressure on them, they're very likely to fold. That's very desirable to us because just the blinds and antes sitting out on the table will represent an increase to our stack of usually about 25 to 30%, something we really want when we're short stacked. Second, moving all in saves us from having to make a tough decision after the flop, especially when we're in a hand against a strong post-flop player. For example, let's say the blinds are 2 and 400, and we have just 10 big blinds. We have 4,000 in our stack. And we're in middle position, and we find ourselves with ace-king. If we make a standard 3x raise and get called by a player on the button who has 30 big blinds in his stack, what happens when we see a flop of 7 of diamonds, 4 of clubs, 9 of diamonds? I mean, all we have is 2 overcards to the board. What does our opponent have? Did he hit? Does he have a pair? A flush draw? With over 8 big blinds in the pot, and just 7 big blinds left in our stack, what are we supposed to do? Do we bet our hand? What do we do if he calls? Are we supposed to check and see if our opponent bets so that he can put the pressure on us? I mean, if he does move in, are we supposed to call with just ace high? Are we supposed to fold? What do we do? I mean, it's just a tough spot, and one that we could have avoided by playing the hand differently. Let's look at the same situation, but this time, instead of raising 3x pre-flop, we just move all in. I mean, the first thing we notice that instead of risking just 10% of his stack to call our hand, we're now asking our opponent to risk fully 1/3 of his stack to stay in the hand. And that's a huge difference. We can really do a lot of damage to his stack. The second thing we notice is that we no longer really have to worry about making a difficult post-flop decision because all of our money is already in the middle. So the hand's just going to play to showdown, and we're going to get to see 5 cards. So how do you decide on when to move all in before the flop? Well, as we've already pointed out, the most important factor in making this decision is really the size of your chip stack in relation to the size of the blinds. If you have a stack that's only about 10 big blinds, you're looking to move in really in the early and middle positions with any pair, and nearly any decent face card that has something with it, like, King Jack, King 10, Queen Jack, Queen 10, those kinds of hands. Now, if you are in the late positions, like on the button, and everybody happens to fold around to you on the button, and you've got like 10 to 12 big blinds, you could actually consider moving in without looking at your cards, because the probability that the small blind and big blind are going to fold is so high that you're almost always just going to get those blinds and antes into your stack. And you know what? If you do get called, you can still win. I mean, any 2 cards can win, right? Likewise, if everybody moves around to your small blind and they've all folded, you could also move in the small blind really without looking at your cards when you're in that serious, serious danger zone of like 10 big blinds. Now, when you get into the 15 to 20 big blind range, you can be a little choosier about your hand selection because you still have time to wait, but you don't want to be too much choosier. I mean, I wouldn't recommend ever moving in without looking at your cards when you have as much as 15 to 20 big blinds. You're not that desperate yet. Ideally, you always want to be the first player to act when you do decide to move all in, as it's always better to bet all in than it is to call all in for your tournament life, because your opponents can fold when you're betting and you can pick up all those blinds and antes. When you're calling, you just have to win the hand. Now, of course, when you have a really good hand that you actually believe to be better than the hand that your opponent has moved all in with, like, you have aces or kings or ace king or queens or even a hand like jacks, then calling all in is certainly acceptable. Another key to moving all in pre-flop is timing. If you have a premium hand, you're going to move in no matter what. But if you're holding something more speculative like King Jack, you would ideally like to make this play against opponents who are likely to fold to your raise. If your stack isn't very short, you're 15 to 20 big blinds isn't so short, but if you're above 20 blinds in the 20 to 25 big blind range, then you can really use the all-in play as an effective way to reshove or re-raise an opponent, where you can put a lot of pressure on an opponent. Let's say again that the blinds are still that 200 and 400, and let's say you have like 20 big blinds in your stack. An opponent with 35 big blinds now makes a standard 3x raise from middle position, and you look down to find a hand like ace of clubs, jack of clubs on the button, a hand that normally you might consider just calling with. Well, this is a good hand, but certainly there are plenty of hands that beat it, which makes calling that much of your stack when you're already a little bit short maybe a poor option. Instead, this is a spot where you really consider re-raising, pushing all in against your opponent to push out the players with the weaker hands than yours and to apply the maximum amount of pressure to the original raiser. Without a premium hand of his own, your re-raise doesn't give him the right odds to call, because he has to call 17x more, which is most of his stack. That means that not only can you steal the valuable blinds and the valuable antes in the pot, but you also get to steal his original raise. And that gives you a lot of time to wait for a good thing to happen to you so you can really increase your stack later. I'm Annie Duke, and in this lesson we're going to look at the fundamentals of game theory as they apply to poker. Now, game theory is a very complex branch of applied mathematics that can take years to understand. Just ask Chris Ferguson, who spent more than 10 years studying the concept at UCLA. For our purposes, however, we're going to define game theory as the attempt to mathematically define behavior in strategic situations where an individual's success in making choices depends on the choices of others. Or to put it more simply, game theory is really just all about strategic thinking in a poker game. One of the keys to maximizing your win rate is to understand how people are reacting to your table image and to their own place in the tournament. Do your opponents think you're loose and they want to get into pots with you? Are they frightened of giving up too many chips because the tournament is, say, getting close to the money bubble? Will they play back at you with a weak hand or wait for a monster? Will they be happy to minimum cash in a tournament? Or, like you, are they playing for the win? Much like it does with bluffing, understanding your table image will help you exploit your opponent's tendencies at critical stages of the tournament. For example, because we know that many players tighten up around the money bubble, this is a good time to open up and play a wider variety of hands, especially from position. Because most players who have made a deep run don't want to risk not cashing, like that would be devastating to them. They're going to lay down a lot of hands that they may have been willing to play earlier in the tournament, giving you a chance to pick up valuable pots without very much resistance. Now, on the other hand, once the bubble bursts, players tend to really drastically loosen up, which means you should shift gears and tighten up your game, especially if you were playing very loose before the bubble burst. Now, since your opponents will still see you as an aggressive, crazy, maniacal player, they're going to be more inclined to play weaker hands against you after that money bubble has burst, and you can look for spots to trap them when now you're actually playing quite tight, so you can be holding very strong hands. In short, game theory relies on exploiting your image and your opponent's tendencies and using all of that against them. Understanding your opponent's psychological state at various stages of the tournament will help you make strategic adjustments to your game and put you in a better position to win. Hi, I'm Annie Duke. Because the relative strength of your hand is so dependent on your position at the table, it only stands to reason that you should be playing the strongest hands possible when you decide to play from the worst possible positions on the table. So let's look at the types of hands you should be holding if you enter the pot in early position. As we mentioned earlier, the problem with entering a pot from early position is that you don't have a lot of information to work with. Obviously, you know what cards you're holding, but you have no idea what kinds of hands the players behind you may be holding. So before you opt to put money into the pot with 6 or 7 players left to act behind you, you should be confident that your hand is strong enough that you would call a raise with it if someone had raised in front of you, or that the hand is strong enough that you could re-raise with it for value. Ideally, we are looking to play only premium and very solid hands, like pairs that are above 7s, ace king and ace queen, and perhaps ace jack suited when we're in early position. What's more, we should be willing to play these hands for a raise when we enter the pot. Raising in early position accomplishes three things. First, it tells our opponent that we have a strong hand that they should respect. Second, it knocks out opponents, so we end up playing the hand against fewer players when those players have position on us. And third, it gives us the lead in the hand, meaning that players with more marginal hands are less likely to raise us before the flop and are more likely to fold to us if we continuation bet after the flop. In the earliest stages of the tournament, when your opponents tend to be playing looser, you really shouldn't be playing anything more than the strongest range of these hands in early position. As the tournament moves on and your opponents become more likely to fold before the flop, then you can open up your range. Just remember, though, the worse your starting hand, the harder you have to connect with the flop in order to win, and the more likely that you will have to bluff in order to win that pot.